Okay, great. It's a real pleasure to be here. So thanks to all of you for taking part. And hopefully this will be fun and interesting for you. So I'm Jasmeer Chhatwal. As Nancy mentioned, I'm a neurologist. I've been at Mass General for almost 15 years now. And I see patients, and I also do lots of research. And on the clinical side, I tend to focus on genetically driven Alzheimer's disease. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, including familial Alzheimer's disease syndrome. So I purposely kept this short, so hopefully we'll have time for lots of questions if people are interested. So a question I get asked a lot, and I think is on a lot of people's mind, is Alzheimer's disease genetic? So Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, is a very, very common disease, and I'll show you some of the percentages in a little bit. But it's one of the most feared consequences of aging, and it's very natural to wonder if a family member is affected, what's my risk? And I'll talk about how to look at that and how to think about that a little bit. But I'm showing this slide at the beginning, and you'll see it a little bit later on too, because the message I want to send home is that having a parent, brother, or sister with Alzheimer's disease increases your risk, but doesn't mean you will develop Alzheimer's disease. The converse is also true, which is that unfortunately, even if you don't have any Alzheimer's disease in your family, there's still some chance you're going to get it. But the point with this particular slide is that sometimes people have a feeling of inevitability and a loss of hope because they have Alzheimer's disease in their family. And I want to just say up front that there's almost no reason to have that. And so I'll start with this and I'll actually end up ending with it too. So the first question is, what is a gene? So we're talking about genetic testing. Let me just mention a little bit of some relevant information about what a gene is. So the way that we encode information on how to make proteins in our traits is in our DNA. A gene is a small section of DNA that codes for a protein. So the DNA is turned into an RNA and then finally into a protein. And the proteins are basically the molecules that can do things. They can break down other proteins, they can help form other proteins, they can be receptors on cells, all kinds of things. So they're the effector molecule. They're the thing that can actually do something. So because DNA codes for our traits in general, that can be things that may not have that much impact on our lifespan, like our eye color and hair color, but they can also relate to things that are very relevant to health, like Alzheimer's disease risk, and that's the part that I'll focus on today. So is Alzheimer's disease heritable? When we say something is heritable, it means can it be passed down in families and inherited as part of the genes people have. So just reiterating what genes are on the left, the current research, and this can change, is that about somewhere between 50 and 80% of AD risk can be attributed somehow in some way to genetic factors. But there's a very substantial portion here shown in that blue pie, the 35% that's related to the environment and importantly, maybe modifiable. And I'm going to talk about that piece. It's a very, very important piece of this pie. So genetics is important, but environment and modification of behavior is also very important. So when we talk about genes, I think it's very helpful to have this basic distinction in mind, that you can have a risk gene. So if you have one of these risk genes, it can increase or decrease the likelihood of developing a disease, but it does not guarantee it will happen or not happen. So those cute little drawings down there, there's ApoE4 on the left, and I'm going to talk a lot about this, is a risk gene. If you have it, you're in increased risk, but it doesn't guarantee you're going to have it. ApoE2 on the right is something that actually reduces risk for Alzheimer's disease, but there's still many people, unfortunately, that have ApoE2 that develop disease. So that's how we think about risk. It's something that changes the likelihood, but it doesn't guarantee that something will happen. That's in contrast to what we see with deterministic genes. So deterministic genes directly cause a disease. And in Alzheimer's disease, there's essentially a guarantee that anyone who inherits them will develop a disorder. So these are very different, but they're also very, very rare. There are risk genes for both late onset Alzheimer's disease and early onset Alzheimer's disease. Most of them are in that early onset category. And so each of us has 23 chromosome pairs. And there's really 4 Alzheimer's genes to think about. And I can make this complicated and talk about rare variants and all these other things, but really it's 4 genes to think about with Alzheimer's disease. The 3 genes that are deterministic, if there's changes in them and will lead to Alzheimer's disease, are APP, PS1, and PS2. I can talk about what those do in a moment, but these are mutations in one of these 3 genes are very rare, but when they do happen, if you inherit a copy of that, you will develop Alzheimer's disease. And in many cases, there's a conserved age of onset within families such that if your family member develops symptoms, say at age 45, which is about the average for these genes, that it's likely that you unfortunately will also develop symptoms around that age, not exactly, but around that age. These deterministic genes have a very striking family inheritance pattern. So the circles and squares that you're seeing down below are an example of a family pedigree. So at the very top, that circle is the matriarch of the family, a woman, and the square is a man. The filled circle indicates that this person carries this gene. And if you look down to the next generation, these are the children, the next row down, about 50% of the children on average will inherit this gene, and unfortunately, in this case, also develop the disease. And it can be passed on through generations like that. So as I mentioned, I do a lot of work with early onset Alzheimer's disease and genetically driven Alzheimer's disease. And so we pay a lot of attention to this, and it can be very important to know about. So I'll tell you what I tell my patients is that if there is such a pattern, somebody is young, developing symptoms, and they have this family pattern that can be fairly striking, I do think it's important to get genetic testing. And there's a variety of different ways to do that. Any which way, there's many labs that can do it, but it's very important who you get the genetic testing through. It's good to have a partner in interpreting the results and understanding what's going on. So it should be done in close consultation with a neurologist or a geriatric psychiatrist. And in some cases, a genetic counselor can also be helpful. And this is a really important point. If it comes up in questions, I can talk about it more, but genetic testing can be really challenging to interpret, and we'll see that in a moment with the APOE4 gene. So the rare variants in APP, PS1, and PS2, they account for less than 1% of the total cases of Alzheimer's disease. So thankfully, these deterministic genes for Alzheimer's disease are actually quite rare. That's in contrast to what we see with what the major genetic risk factor that we know about in the overall population, which is APOE4. So this is a gene, as I said, discovered in 1993, and it was the first gene in which variations were found to increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease, and it remains the risk gene with the greatest known impact. Importantly, this is a risk gene, not a deterministic gene, and so that means that having this mutation does not necessarily mean that the person will develop disease. This protein itself is responsible for prompting, this gene is responsible for prompting your body to make a particular protein called apolipoprotein E. There's different forms of this. So in the overall population, there's versions 2, 3, and 4. If you carry a copy of APOE2, this is mildly protective against Alzheimer's disease, and it reduces overall inflammation in the brain. About 22% of the population has this allele. The most common APOE form in the overall population is APOE3. Roughly 50% of the population has it. And people with APOE3 have an average risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and I'll talk about what an average risk is in a slide in just a moment. It's very commonly talked about in the media, APOE4. This is the high-risk variant, and about 25% of the population has one copy of this gene, and about 3%, it's actually a little bit less than that, have 2 copies of the gene. So having one copy of the APOE4 gene increases AD risk by about 2 to 3 times, and 2 copies raises the risk by 10 to 15 times. But I'll show you the numbers. Even having 2 copies of this gene is not deterministic. It doesn't mean you're going to absolutely for sure develop Alzheimer's disease, even though that's a common misconception, even in fairly informed articles in the media. Okay. APOE4 is an equal opportunity offender, roughly. So if you look across different ethnicities in different parts of the world, there's very modest variations in how many APOE4 genes are carried on average. So in this particular figure, these colorful bar plots, this is actually from 23andMe, and I'll talk more about what that testing is in a second. But you can see in the pink here, this is the portion of population that has 0 E4 variants, okay? In blue are people that carry 1 copy of APOE4, and in yellow are those that carry 2. And so there are some variations across different groups of European, African American, Latino, Asian populations. But you can see that it's fairly similar across populations, even though there is some slight variation. So for better or worse, this is a fairly equal opportunity offender and can affect people across the planet. So overall, there's about a 9% risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So if you have no copies of the APOE4 gene, and that's roughly 250 million Americans, you have about a 9% chance, a lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. If you have 1 copy, and that's roughly 70 million people, that's a lot of people. You have about a 30% lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And if you have 2, it's in the range of 50%, probably a little bit more than 50%, maybe closer to 60%. So there's 2 ways to think about that. So if you have 2 copies, 60% is a lot, but it also means that 40% of the time you won't develop disease. And I want to emphasize that point because people sometimes have this lack of hope and think that it's inevitable that they'll develop disease if they carry that. So I'm kind of reinforcing that point over and over again. The other thing I'd like to point out is that if you put together the people that have at least 1 copy of the APOE4 gene, in this figure, it's 77 million Americans. So if you think about that, that's probably not that dissimilar from people that have green eyes in terms of the overall percentage of the population. So having APOE4 is not rare, and it's part of normal, okay? And Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, is also part of a normal, life experience. It's a very common disease. So there's things that you can do if you have APOE4 or if you have other risk factors for Alzheimer's disease that can reduce the chance that you develop symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And I want to emphasize again, as we looked at one of the earlier charts, there's modifiable and environmental risk factors that can feed into your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and modifying those can be very valuable even if you carry one of these risk alleles. And this is also data from 23andMe. So if you look at these bar graphs, in pink are people that have done no exercise, and in blue it's just modest exercise, 30 minutes, as it's showing, 30 minutes per week. That's a pretty modest amount, right? You can see that there's quite a lot of difference in terms of the rate of developing Alzheimer's disease based on exercise. So this is an example of one behavioral modification that may be helpful, and that's true even if you have E4. So again, if you have one of these risk alleles, it's not for certain you're going to develop the disease, and there are things that you can do to reduce your risk. This is one of them. In our own studies, we've actually been able to put a number to a lot of this and get very, very precise about what this can mean and how powerful some of these changes can be. So this is from a local study that perhaps people on the call are part of, called the Harvard Aging Brain Study. And I'm not going to go through the details. My group published this a few years ago. This is looking at the number of steps people take in a day. So these are, on the right-hand side, are people that have high amyloid buildup in the brain. So these are people who unfortunately are very high risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And those blue and red lines are showing people that have low and high levels of activity. And the take-home point here is that those that had lower levels of physical activity showed more cognitive decline over time, whereas people that had higher levels of activity stayed fairly stable over time. Again, this is putting exact figures and numbers to what I showed you before, that there are things that you can modify, even if you have risk based on the gene, or in this case, risk based on high amyloid burden in the brain. And we can directly tie these differences in physical activity to how much brain tissue is present. So the colorful regions of brain shown here are the ones that show greater cortical thickness. So there's more brain there in people that had high physical activity, even if they had elevated amyloid burden. So again, there are things in the environment and in our own life choices that can impact the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, even if we are at high risk. Another thing that we think can impact the development of symptoms is sleep. So I'll just take this opportunity to mention one of my studies. So I'm involved in the Harvard Aging Brain Study as well. Another study, one that I run, is looking at how sleep influences memory and brain aging, and called the SONNET study. There's a contact there, and Nancy and others can also clue you in to who you might talk to if you're interested in this. But as part of this study, we directly look at the brain, look at buildup of the amyloid and tau proteins. We look at how much brain is there using very special MRIs. And we see how people are sleeping. So in that nice little picture that's down there of somebody, they're having brainwave patterns reported as they sleep. And it turns out that there's relationships between those brainwaves, how people sleep, how much they sleep, and the development of tau in the brain and in cognitive decline. And we're trying to learn more about that. And this is a potentially modifiable risk factor as well. So getting back to the question of, is Alzheimer's disease heritable? This is a variation of the slide that I showed you before. Again, I want to emphasize that there's a substantial amount that's related to genetics, but also a substantial amount that's not, that's modifiable and in the environment. If you think about the contribution to heritability, FAD over here, FAD loci, those are talking about those rare mutations that are deterministic. So it's a very small number of people that are affected. They're a very important group of people, and we really need to help them, but thankfully it's a small group that has these deterministic genes. Past that is everything else, and ApoE4 is probably the single greatest risk factor. It almost certainly is the single greatest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease that's common. And then the rest of our genes are the rest, that chart over there, that little pie chart over there. What about 23andMe? So this is inspired by Nancy, as I told her. This has been in the news. It's in the group consciousness. So 23andMe is a commercial testing service that can look at genetic variations and give us information about what's contained in our genes. So what it does is it looks for very small stretches of genetic variation that differentiate people. These are single nucleotide polymorphisms. So what these are little bits of DNA. And from those, you can infer the presence of particular genes or genetic changes or genetic mutations. So what 23andMe does is it can detect whether or not somebody has an ApoE4 allele and tell them whether they have one or two copies. It doesn't necessarily test for the other ApoE variants. And it's overall has good performance, but it's not a direct test of the gene itself. There's something called whole genome sequencing or exome sequencing that can be a more careful look at the same thing. I'll state up front, I don't recommend getting 23andMe performed solely to test for an ApoE4 allele. On the right is what happens when you do 23andMe, and this is actually my result, so I can talk about it. This is actually what the screen looks like. So I don't carry the ApoE4 allele. This is the little web browser that you get. The marker that's tested over here, this RS429358, is the single nucleotide polymorphism that I was talking about. And the explanation is actually given really well here. I think they do a good job of explaining to people what they're testing for and what it means, but it requires a careful eye. And sometimes it can be helpful to talk with people that are well-versed in this type of science to help you interpret it. So in this particular case, this is, like I said, mine. So I have two copies of the ApoE3. So I'm as boring as you can be, the most common genotype there is for ApoE3. So exactly at average risk for Alzheimer's disease. You can see that this variant, having two copies of ApoE3, you can see it's different across different ethnic groups, but fairly similar. It's different, but within a fairly small range. Okay. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I don't recommend that 23andMe be performed solely to test for an ApoE4 allele. And the reason is this, because it's really, really hard to interpret. So this is a very useful chart. Again, this is real 23andMe data, and I think that they've done a really nice job, I think, in explaining it. The general population is shown here. If you look at by age, roughly 11% of people over age 85 will develop Alzheimer's disease if they're men, and about 14% for women. Now, the part of this may be due to the fact that women live longer. So age 85, more women reach age 85 than men do. And that's not completely accounted for in these percentages, but overall, we think women are at slightly higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. If you have no E4 variant, so this is me on this line, a male who has no E4 variants, this is the risk over time. And you can see it's substantial. So it's still 5 to 8% above age 85, but you can see it's very tightly related to age and different at younger ages. In terms of having a risk, here, okay, I'm going to focus in on two things and explain them. So let's say you did 23andMe and found out that you had one copy of the E4 variant. If you're a man, here's the risk. So if you're at age 65, there's a 1% risk. At age 75, there's about an average of about 6% risk. And at age 85, there's around a 20 to 25% risk. This is what I mean by not deterministic. That means 75% of people with an E4 allele at age 85 will not develop Alzheimer's disease. That number is slightly higher for women, as you're seeing here, but still the vast majority of people that have one E4 gene, even at age 85, do not have Alzheimer's disease. It's a very common misconception that people think about that. And when you're looking at these numbers, I just put in the average male life expectancy and female life expectancy. This is purposely the year before COVID started because there was a slight change because of the deaths associated with COVID. So this was the last measurement before COVID in the US. The male life expectancy that year was 76.3 and the female life expectancy was 81.4. So when you figure that into reading this chart, you can see that in fact, it's even a larger majority that don't develop disease because unfortunately, sometimes people will pass away of other things before they could show symptoms. Even if you have two copies of the E4 gene, you can still see that roughly 40 to 50% of people, even at age 85, don't have Alzheimer's disease. So it's very important for people to understand that if you do 23andMe or you know some other way that you carry the E4 allele, that it's not inevitable that you're going to develop Alzheimer's disease. And so where does that leave us? I think it leaves us kind of where we started, which is that having a parent, brother or sister with Alzheimer's disease increases your risk, but doesn't mean you will develop Alzheimer's disease. The only real exception to this is if you have a very strong family inheritance pattern. If you do, see someone like me in clinic, get the genetic testing, and you can have the answers there. But that's a very rare case where you sort of see inheritance patterns quite like that. And as I said, I purposely left this short, so I'm going to thank you for your attention and see, we're going to hear from Mike. And also, if you have any questions, I'll stay around for the whole time.
Mike, you're muted.
I just realized that. Got a Mr. Techno Geek over here, right? But I was just thanking you, doctor, for explaining all those things, and a lot of things in there I wasn't aware of myself, so I really appreciate you going through it in great detail. I guess my story's, I don't want to say a little different, but it is somewhat different. We were concerned because I was diagnosed so young at 52 years old. But when we looked, of course, we talked to my parents and we looked back through our family tree, there was no real history of Alzheimer's disease. And of course, that's the first thing everybody thinks about or talks about. And again, it wasn't until a couple of years later that the diagnosis was changed to Lewy body with Parkinsonism. But when we look at my wife's side of the family, her grandmother had a form of dementia that unfortunately we don't know exactly what form it was. She had 10 children, 2 are still living. And I believe it was either 2 or 3, including her father, who is in a assisted living facility right now, who has dementia. And again, we don't know what form it is. Different angle in that I know there's a lot of people out there that are interested in this, but they're also scared to even go talk to a doctor or to get any type of testing at all. And I can personally attest to this. My mom did die from a form of dementia. Again, we don't know what type, but I do know she was too scared to even go talk to the doctor. The same thing with my father-in-law. And for me, what made us go get looked at so early was because of changes in myself, changes in my personality, things that were happening to me at work. I was in a very high skilled type job. I was in telecommunications, and my multitasking skills were diminishing pretty fast. I was forgetful, not a lot, but I was forgetful. I did get lost coming home from work on a couple of occasions, but even more so, my personality was changing. I was always a laid back type of person, very calm. Was very active in my community, volunteering on the different town committees, school committee, and so forth. I loved fishing, I loved photography, and I started withdrawing from doing a lot of those things that I enjoyed doing before. And this might sound a little off the wall to some people, but again, we knew something was happening, and seeking out and not being satisfied with what we were first being told by a doctor, because at first we were told it's depression. So we went to a psychiatrist, and then we were told, well, maybe it's Lyme disease. So we get tested for that, and then it's something else. And I realized that right now there's no real one test for certain that will tell you you have a form of dementia. But I will tell you this, and this is the part that might sound a little bit off the wall, is not being satisfied with what we were being told and pushing to get a more definitive answer of what was wrong with me actually saved my marriage. And it saved my marriage because of the way I was changing. I wasn't the same person that my wife had married. I mean, at the time, I'd been married for over 30 years. And like I said, I went from this very calm, relaxed type person to easily getting angered, to getting frustrated, to not wanting to go out, to not wanting to do things. And my wife actually told me probably a year or so after the diagnosis that she was close to calling a lawyer. And, so I jokingly tell people, if you're gonna, go through things like that, I tell guys, don't joke about it with your wife, because she's going to do one of two things. She's either going to call a doctor or she's going to call a lawyer. And luckily for me, the year before, she called the doctor. We are still married. We just celebrated our 42nd anniversary. So I guess the angle that I'm trying to come across with is for people, if you think something is wrong, please don't be afraid to go talk to your doctor. And if you're not happy with the answers you're getting, seek another doctor, or seek someone who, like Dr. Jazz, who's more in tune with what's going on. Are we concerned about the genetic part of this? Absolutely. I mean, the fact that I have it, the fact that it does seem to run in my wife's side of the family, of course, we're concerned for my kids and my grandkids. And to be honest with you, that's what led me to get involved in research, to do anything that I can possibly do to help hopefully find a cure or something to even slow it down or to find answers. But if nothing else is even just to raise awareness for people. I told folks I'd love to walk around with a t-shirt that says, I have dementia, ask me a question. You know, I mean, people aren't going to know unless you talk about it. It can be a scary disease because people are afraid of what's going to happen to them. But I can tell you, I think what's even scarier is having something happening to you and not knowing what it is, and then not doing anything about it. When we found out about our diagnosis, it obviously changed everything for us, but it didn't stop me from living. I have a little signature on my email from a quote from one of my favorite movies, and I see Patty Sullivan smiling because she already knows what it's going to say, what I'm going to say, but it's a quote from the movie Shawshank Redemption, and there's a line in the movie that Morgan Freeman repeats: "Get busy living or get busy dying." And I've chosen to try to get busy living, and I still volunteer at my local senior center, helping folks with technology problems. That was my career. That's what I did for a living. I enjoy the heck out of our grandkids. We just went to my granddaughter's middle school spring concert where she did a clarinet solo. And of course, you know who was jumping up in the air the most, making the most noise. But really and truly, this disease is scary, but please don't let it stop you from asking questions, looking into it. If you suspect a family member maybe having issues, talk to them about it. It's never going to happen unless people talk about it. So I guess I'm going to kind of end it there and turn it back over to Nancy. And I know Doctor has tons of knowledge that he can answer plenty of questions, and anything that I can answer myself, I'd be more than happy to. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Jazz, for a fabulous presentation. So we have a number of questions in the chat. I'm going to stop the recording and I will start to ask the questions